name is Sada Mire. I'm an archaeologist, and I have been working in archaeology for the past 20 years. I have always loved learning about the past. When I was a child, I loved listening to stories. I loved reading books. I was lucky enough to be raised by my grandmother, a woman who came from Hood region. She was very knowledgeable about the time when she was young, and she was the first person who told me about the history of Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. She told me about the time when her clan killed Gibb, a colonial British officer, and how she became refugee, and the poems that she composed about that experience. And when I became refugee myself, decades later, I ended up in Sweden, and I had taken for granted that our culture and history were known, at least that African history was known, but it wasn't the case. I realized that when in my secondary school I was presented with our history book, and it was a big book. However, there was only one page on Africa. It was a shock to me. It was simply just a paragraph mentioning the transatlantic slave trade. And there was a map, very vague map, with arrows pointing to from Africa to the Americas, with the arrows showing where the slave routes were. So I went to my local library and I found a book. This book was called Africa, the History of a Continent, by a British journalist, Basil Davidson. And within the first couple of pages, I saw a picture of Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. This book made sense to me. There was all these African civilizations, all this history of Africa that my school book was lacking. But there was also a sentence in that book that said, in order to write African history, we need to do archaeological research. At the time, I didn't know what archaeological research was. I was just a secondary school. But a few years later, I enrolled for archaeology. As a person, as I said, I've always loved history, hearing about the past and reading books. When I came to Sweden, I've always wondered what I have in common with the Swedish people. So I used my love for literature to explore Swedish culture, traditions, and history. I fell in love with the authors of the late 19th century and early 20th century because the experience at the time of poverty in Sweden, where 1.2 million people fled to the United States, resonated with me. And then I started reading further back in history, medieval times. I finally decided I wanted to do archaeology. I also wanted to know about my own people and their history beyond what my grandmother had told me, beyond the 20th century. So I enrolled in archaeology at Lund University in August 2001. And within a couple of years, I started focusing on African archaeology, and I came to London. When I came to London, I realized that not many Africans were studying archaeology. At the time, I was the only undergraduate student studying African archaeology. And when I decided to do the archaeology of the Horn of Africa, I was the only person studying this. There weren't even specialists on the topic at my university in graduate and postgraduate. So there were other scholars who were specializing in different fields, but no one specializing on the Horn of Africa. I decided to come to Somaliland and to do archaeology. I spoke to my family. They were very supportive. I applied for funding, but I didn't get funding because I was told by the institutions that Somaliland was part of Somalia, and Somalia had other priorities in terms of what was going on at the time. I contacted Somaliland authorities, and they were very welcoming. So although I didn't have any money, I was able to at least come, and my family helped me. My relatives helped me. So I arrived in Hargeisa in mid-September 2007. My mother was with me. The next day, we immediately went out to the landscapes. I had this feeling of excitement, which is extremely different to the feeling I had as a young refugee, as a child refugee, IDP who was internally displaced in Somalia and then became refugee in Ethiopia, and who had already been in Hargeisa at the time in 1991 and seen the destruction firsthand. We were dodging landmines. We were seeing dead bodies and bones and destroyed structures. Something that only reminded me of Dresden in World War II. This time, in 2007, I was a young researcher dedicated to making a difference, and already I had taken a path where I had already faced so many difficulties, and coming to Hargeisa and seeing what people here had created in the 16 years I was in exile just inspired me and fueled me that they had nothing, but they built everything from the ground. And I felt I didn't have funds, but I could still build from the ground. So immediately next day, my mother and two of my relatives, my uncle, who was a professional mechanic, drove us, and my cousin, who was a filmmaker, joined me. So the four of us set off to my mother's region, Sahel, Berbera, Daimole, Demergora, Lasa Da'awo, all the way to Golis.
Welcome to Berbera City.
I had the most extraordinary time. Wherever we went, we met family members, nomads, who were my relatives, who were guiding me. I had an album with me of archaeological sites that I had collected, things that I knew potentially existed in the country. And everywhere I would show people and say, have you seen anything like this? And soon enough, people would say, yes, there is something like this on that side of the mountain, in that area. And we would drive there. And it was a bottom-up exploration. I had no institutional backing. I had no government backing. I had no connections with anybody. I just knew this was something I wanted to do. I had questions about our history. Where do Somali people come from? How far back do we go in history? What is our archaeology like? What can we do with it to make it part of our society, to prosper to study for history, to study for education, to attract the world. Where do we fit in the world as a people? And I tried to engage people with these questions, and I realized that people were actually equally excited about it as I was. My mother was equally excited, although she didn't understand what archaeology really was. She knew there were things that she didn't know. Similarly to everyone, they knew, they had dim awareness of our culture, of our history, but they didn't know about tangible things and evidence. And as a child, I grew up with my father. My father was a police officer. He was one of the first people to be trained in fingerprint. He worked as a police officer, as a CID in Somaliland during the protectorate, and then he worked in Somalia at the CID in Mogadishu, and he was known as number 5, and he was known to be the person that the most difficult cases were brought to when there were criminal investigations. And I remember as a child growing up with him in Mogadishu, watching detectives, and he would tell me about how important it is to not disturb the place, the scene, so that the crime scene should be documented without any contamination. And at the time I didn't really understand what he meant, but later as an archaeologist it dawned on me that this was exactly the same thing we were doing. When we are excavating, we are documenting things the way they are, and we are trying to avoid any contamination. And we are preserving things in situ. So I had already known that evidence is important for any arguments you make. Another important element was, as I said, my grandmother, who told me about stories. So she taught me a lot about the landscape as a child, but I could only imagine that landscape, but now I was actually walking the places in Daymole where she used to tell me about. And I was asking people, is this tree this? Is this tree sok? Is this golol? All these golol? Is this that? So I was asking people about the things she taught me. And as a child, she used to tell me about things that she gathered, the nuts, the berries that she used to eat. And I remember salivating as a child, thinking I'd love to eat those things that she's just randomly gathering from the landscape. And I also have my mother with me, my mother who's adventurous, who's independent, who traveled in Asia, in Africa, independently. But she was also a nurse, and she worked as a nurse, started very early training as a nurse, as a teenager, and she was placed in different parts of Somaliland during the protectorate, which meant that she was very familiar with the country. When she married my father, they were together. He was a policeman, positioned in different parts of the country. So again, she got to know very well different parts. So it turned out to be really the dream team, and we had a fantastic dynamic throughout the whole documentation. And then we went to the western side, to my paternal side of the family, because obviously I didn't have a funds for the fieldwork. So my family were the people who were genuinely willing me to succeed, and I didn't have to pay them. And we were just, iska wax u qabso kind of archaeological project. So they helped me, and then we went all the way to the western region, to the Hode. We went to see sites, even area of Buligwedle, further down even in Ethiopia, on the border. It was a time now when I had no idea that there were other people involved. There were a couple of people that I knew were involved with Somaliland archaeology, and I had contacted them and sent them emails, but I hadn't got any replies from them. So, and because I didn't have much time and resources, I had gone out and had my family help me. And then when I came back, after a month of mapping and dotting sites on a map with my GPS and collecting all these GPS numbers and gathering all this data and information, I came back and I contacted again the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they said to me, go to the Ministry of Culture. And that's when I got introduced to a couple of people who were doing and surveying archaeology at the ministry. But immediately what became clear, the archaeology of Somaliland had many actors who were there before me and who were active. Some of them I had heard of, and I emailed them, and I haven't gotten a reply from them at the time. Foreign, diaspora and locals. There was a chaotic scene, and at some point I came to the realization that it was actually quite toxic as well, and it was almost like another kind of landmine field. When I first came to the ministry, I met the minister, and the minister had already heard about me because unknown to me, an article by my university had reached people in Hargeisa and was actually published on the cover of the Horn Tribune. And he showed me the magazine and he said, "We've been waiting for you." And I had been out in the countryside, as I said, to my maternal side of the family, to my paternal side of the family, and surveying all over their regions. So I said to him that I wanted to help. So we agreed that I should see Somaliland's president with the material I have collected that I had in my laptop and my cameras, and show that to the president, have one-to-one meeting with President Dahir Riale Kahin, and show him the very rich archaeology that this country has, and the fact that we need a department of archaeology. Because the ministry, there was no department of archaeology. There were different people based in different parts. So there was no consolidation by Somaliland government of its heritage. It didn't have a department for archaeology. It was just sporadic missions by foreigners and a local person or a few local people who would take them to sites. So I wanted the government to actually have a department so that they can govern their archaeological and heritage resources. Lucky for me, Mr. Riale Kahin, he was very interested in the topic. So the president, Dahir Rialo Kahin, agreed that we need a department of archaeology, and he said that I should build the department and hand him within 3 days a budget for a new department of archaeology. This was a great outcome because I had this dusty laptop with a lot of sites. I had never met a higher official like the president. So for a student, it was a very encouraging moment, and I was very encouraged by the minister, Abdurrazak Roblewaberi, who was a champion for the starting of Department of Archaeology in Somaliland. So by setting up a Department of Archaeology and having the people who already were involved organized within that department, we were able to create a quick policy paper to say that all archaeological work will go through the government department and will be approved by the government, and that also there would be no illicit diggings of archaeological sites, because before I came, anybody who wanted to excavate anywhere was free to do that. And I have seen some of the agreements that some foreign institutions made with Somaliland, and they were literally nothing you would see in anywhere in the world. They were given a total monopoly to foreign institutions, to the point where any local person who was a researcher would not have been able to pursue archaeology. It was a shock to me because I knew in many parts of the world archaeology has moved on from being this conventional discipline where certain people run other people's archaeology. I set up and continue the programs I'd started, and so public education, lectures, media campaign against illicit digging, awareness raising, heritage awareness, heritage debates, and making locals aware that it's not okay that people dig up archaeological sites without clear permission from the Department of Archaeology. And I suggested that actually we should not excavate any archaeological sites and only focus on documentation of sites until we have national heritage law. And that's why I have never excavated a single archaeological site in Somaliland, because I believe you have to walk the talk yourself. But I also faced a lot of problems, a lot of pressure from people who were already excavating, either if they were foreigners, locals working with foreigners, or diaspora who were part of illicit antiquities trade. Having the Department of Archaeology made Somaliland independent of anybody, so that itself governs its archaeology. Within a couple of years, I left as the director of archaeology, and I set up a civil society organization working with communities and doing archaeology along with collaborating with the government. So my work has in the past, since 2011, continued through my university affiliations and by implementing it through local civil society organizations, and mainly Horn Heritage Foundation.